week's episode of the Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show. Well, not last week's episode, the last episode of the show. Liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. I'm afraid there wasn't an episode last week because I had to cover a member of staff who was off on Saturday. I actually had to do the same this week as well, but I've managed to sort of jig the weekend so I can do an episode of the show, because I love doing these episodes of the show, even though they take a large proportion of the Sunday up, but never mind, I do enjoy them. Yeah, right, okay, so this week's episode of the show was kind of a bit of a surprise, no, not surprise, a bit of a kind of an unexpected episode, shall we say. As you recall, I've redecorated the study, and prior to the redecoration I had little groups of samples sort of dotted all over the place on shelves and so on, waiting for their moment, and obviously when I redecorated, everything got put into boxes, and some big boxes, it has to be said. So I was doing some rummaging looking for some samples for an episode I had in mind, but unfortunately didn't manage to find them. But I found these. These are this is a selection of blended whiskies that I was, planning to do an episode of the show, and I thought, let's do an episode on blended whiskies. I like doing them from time to time. They're generally, some of them are relatively inexpensive, some of them are really good, some of them are not quite so good. As we well know, they're all blended whiskies do have a tendency to be made to fit a price point, and if it's cheap and cheerful, then the ingredients are going to be cheap and cheerful at the end of the day. But anyway, so I'll introduce the lineup, and I'll introduce the sort of the actual blends as we kind of go along. So kind of all doing it all in one. So yeah, let's take it.
You can put your head down. You can just
right. Okay, so I'm going to kick off with two from the same label, for want of a better word. So 2 bottlings of Scottish Leader. The first bottling we'll be looking at is the original, bottled at 40%, and the second bottling we'll be looking at is called the Signature. Now, Scottish Leader was a fairly recent blend in relative terms, and relative Scottish whisky terms, I suppose. It was established in 1976 by Burns Stewart, and it's not really a sort of a lot of, as some of the other ones we'll get onto, date back to the sort of 1800s and have this sort of like lovely backstory. Scotch Leader is just a blend that was created, apparently. It was rejigged in 2014, which is what I think this sample comes from, and the samples are all fine. The malt content apparently was increased. It's blended from over 40 different grain and malt whiskies. Obviously, as you know, Burns Stewart sort of own the lovely Deanston distillery. They also own Tobermory, and they own Bunnahabhain. So one imagines that some, or none, maybe, who knows, of those malts go into the blend. So I think the Signature was a sort of like a relatively newer bottling. I think they had the original, and that was pretty much the standard bottling, and it's apparently sort of it was developed around about 2014 to sort of flesh out the range, I imagine. And I don't know an awful lot much more about it, apart from then I imagine it was maybe sort of older spirits, something like that. I don't know. We'll find out if there's any huge amount of difference between the two. The third bottling we're looking at is the Black Bottle 10-year-old, again bottled at 40%. Black Bottle is an old historic brand and was introduced in 1879 by Charles David and Gordon Graham. It's had a bit of a checkered history. It was sort of apparently a bit of a what's the word? A bit of a rough old blend in the early days, apparently, and it wasn't until sort of the 90s when the brand was purchased by Allied Distillers that they actually kind of cleaned it up and sort of decided that they were going to go down this Islay path, as a number of you probably will remember. So the iconic bottle that was shaped like a still, and it was basically You could argue a little bit of a gimmick in that they claimed that it was made from all of the whiskies that were produced on Islay at the time, and it wasn't a bad blend at the time. I remember it being really quite pleasant. And it wasn't until the brand was sold to Edrington that, sometime after it was sold to Edrington, Ian Macmillan, who was then sort of master blender at Edrington, decided that the realistic thing was to sort of go back to its roots, and its roots were in the Highlands as opposed to Ireland. I also think that they maybe couldn't quite get hold of all of the spirit that they actually wanted as well. So instead of sort of saying, well, it's made up of some of the Islay distilleries, they probably decided that it might be just as wise just to kind of ditch all of that kind of advertising. And so it was rebranded and all that kind of stuff, and it was based around sort of like a Highland blend. And they were saying all the right things. I mean, as you know, with these kind of press releases and stuff like that, there's a lot of waffle, shall we say, and how about sort of we're reinventing the brand, or we're kind of going back to its roots, and we're honouring the past, and all this kind of wonderful stuff. But anyway, so rebranded as a Highland a few years back. 11 years ago now, in actual fact. Where does the time go? It has to be said. And since then, they've expanded the range. So this is the 10-year-old that we're looking at. There's obviously the no age statement bottling, and there's several new ones that have kind of come and gone, sort of different cask types and all that. So they're obviously sort of evolving and trying to keep the brand relevant, as they say. Well, all right, I'll try and avoid too much of that kind of talk because anyway. Next bottling I'm going to go on to, I mean, I love the bottle. I mean, the bottle looks really, really cool. It's called William Lawson's 13-year-old, and again, bottled at 40%. Apparently, William Lawson was an export manager for a company called Ian J. Burke's Blending Company, who were in Dublin, and at some point in the sort of 1860s founded his own blended whiskey, and in the 80s it was purchased by Martini and Rosso. Well, it was actually purchased by Clan Monroe, who are owned by Martini and Rosso. The blended whiskey market or hierarchy structure is quite confusing at times. You have companies that own a brand, that own another brand, and so on and so forth. But anyway, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. It's just a bit of an interesting sort of story. Anyway, so the company was, or the blend name was changed to William Lawson Distillers, or the company was changed to William Lawson Distillers, and they acquired the Macduff Distillery, which they used as back in the 60s, which was then used to sort of form the basis of the blend. I mean, and the thing is, with, of course, as we know with blends, they do change over time. Sometimes it's because owners decide they're going to go for a complete relaunch. Sometimes it's because the component parts are no longer available, and as you know, blenders would start buying distilleries to basically make sure they had those component parts. So as we know, Macduff can be a bit, what's the polite way of saying it, rough as hell at times. Who was it that coined the train? Oh, I think it was what's his face, wasn't it? God, I can't think of his name now. When he said, this Macduff is Macduffing my taste buds up. Anyway, so yes, it's not exactly what you might call a lovely soft and sweet and fruity kind of whiskey, but apparently that's what lies at the basis of this particular blend. Apparently it's quite popular overseas. I don't recall ever seeing it in the UK, but yeah, it's apparently very big in France, Spain, Portugal, and Mexico, in actual fact. Anyway, on to the next bottling. No, that's the Lawson's. On to the next bottling. I'm talking so much I'm losing track of where I am. Famous Grouse. Yes, you have heard it correct. This is a bottle of Famous Grouse. It's probably the first and the last time that you will ever see a bottle of Famous Grouse on the show. But it's not any old Grouse. It's not any old Grouse. Apparently this was a limited edition 16-year-old that was released probably, I think, back in 2014 or 2015, something like that. I've never seen it since. As you know, Famous Grouse was founded in the 1800s by a chap called John Brown, who owned a grocery shop in Perth, apparently. And it sort of wound its way down through various members of the family until it was purchased in the 60s by Highland Distillers, apparently for 1.25 million, which is a hell of a lot of money back in the 1960s. But they then sold it in 1999 to Edrington, who paid the princely sum of £601 million for the brand. I mean, wow, that's good business, it has to be said. Anyway, so no idea whether the current sort of Grouse has any bearing to the original bottling. I mean, obviously, as we know, Edrington owns Glenrothes, Glenturret, Highland Park and Macallan. So when you look at it on paper, what should be going into this blend should be pretty good. But of course, as we know, as I said earlier on, it's all made to a price point. It's got some probably the sort of bog standard Famous Grouse is really rough. It's very, very grain orientated, young grain, not a great deal of malt. But anyway, this is apparently the 16-year-old and is comprised of 8 whiskies, apparently. One imagines, obviously, 4 of them of the ones that they own, and probably a couple of other ones with a couple of grains, I would imagine, chucked in. So this was blended together, married in a combination of first fill Spanish sherry and American bourbon casks. So kind of looking forward to that. Incidentally, when I got sent the sample, as you can see from the label, it just had the number 12 written on it, and I think I might have reviewed this for the Whisky magazine, so I had absolutely no idea what the hell it was at all. So yeah, interesting. Final whisky of the day, which obviously is kind of lacking a glass still, is Label 5 blended Scotch whisky, extra rare 18-year-old. Again, bottled at 40%, as pretty much every bloody blend seems to be these days, which is a bit of a shame, but then there you go. As I keep saying, it's all about the price. So Label 5 is actually owned by La Martinquaise, the French group, or the French company. And I believe this was established in 1934, this particular blend. The company was founded in 1934. The blend, I don't think, was actually established until the 60s. They've kind of like grown and developed as a company, I believe, and this is, like I said, this is their Label 5 blended whisky. Again, I think it's probably more popular on the continent than it is over here. I think there's a number of different bottlings within the Label 5 range, this the 18-year-old, I think, was added in 2013 to the range. So I think it's going to be an interesting episode. We've got sort of no age statement right the way through to an 18-year-old. So plenty of age, plenty of hopefully interest, and bloody hell, a Famous Grouse. Would you believe it? Anyway. Let's start with the first ones, which they've just completely gone out of my head because I've been waffling too much. But we'll kick off. Okay, so Scottish Leader we're going to start with. You'll have to excuse me, I've got a little bit of a cold, got a bit of a sore throat, although my faculties seem to be okay, apart from my mental ones, which apparently seem to be all over the place this morning. Anyway, no, it's actually this afternoon, I tell a lie. Anyway, let's see what the Scottish Leader Original comes across like. That's pleasant, quite dense, quite honeyed, bit of oak, a little bit of tropical fruit, apricot, a little bit of smoke. There's a little bit of a nip from the grain. I mean, that's actually quite complex. I mean, considering the amount of different whiskies that kind of go into this particular blend, it's either going to sort of come out at the other side as a little bit homogeneous and sort of, that part of the problem is when you use so many components, they all kind of sort of merge into sort of like a you know, a morass to a certain extent. But you know what? I think this is actually quite pleasant. I don't think it's a very expensive blend. It seems well put together. I'm not getting sort of huge amounts of grain whiskey. I mean, there's certainly a fair amount of grain there. I mean, I don't know, 20, maybe 30% malt, which is actually quite high for a blend, I would have thought. Anyway, let's see what that's on. It's a lot of oak. It's a bit short. The grain does kind of come through on the finish. It's not grippy grain. It's not nippy. It's got a softness to it. The oak is kind of underpinning it all, and I think this is what they're trying to achieve here. Is they're obviously not using particularly expensive or old whiskies, so they've kind of ramped up the first fill oak really to sort of not kind of cover it up, but to sort of like, you know, flesh it out, give it some body, and it's worked. I mean, it's a very pleasant whiskey, you know. It's not going to set you sort of like your pants on fire, but you know, if you were handed a glass of this, you wouldn't be too upset, I don't think. Right, okay, so let's move on to the signature. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Okay, so I can see the correlation with the original, although a little bit more malt, feels like there's more malt, there's a little bit more fragrant barley, a little bit less oak, or less obtuse oak anyway, bit of orange blossom. It's a nice tropical or subtropical kind of strata underneath, getting a little bit of melon, possibly apricot. It's got some nice maturity. It's got a little bit of Speyside green fruit, a little bit of grain. It's actually quite well contained. Again, yeah, not a bad whiskey at all. You'd be more than happy to sort of, if you were handed a glass of this. Well, certainly anyway, from the nose perspective. Anyway, let's see what it passes like. Oily, probably a little bit too oily possibly, if that makes sense. Nowhere near as complex as the palate. It's got a nice smokiness on the aftertaste. It's got a good length. It's not as complex as the nose would kind of lead you to believe. It's got some slightly tropical fruit. It's got a little bit of apricot, touch of honey, some cocoa coming through, not so much oak, nowhere near as much oak as the original, so they're obviously more happy with allowing the spirit character to come through without having to sort of, you know, bolster it with so much oak. And it does feel like it's got a little bit of peated malts in it, whereas I didn't really get an awful lot of that on the original, and that smokiness is kind of lingering, and it's kind of, I suppose, adding a slight sort of difference to it. But overall, I thought the nose was really good, but the palate was just a little bit disappointing, I think. But still, a pretty good blend at the end.
It's true, I won't have to fight you.
Right, okay, so let's move on to the black bottle. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Nice nose. That's got some lovely weight and density, macerated apricot, vanilla, a little bit of smoke, a little bit of salt, fleshy fruit. Actually smells a little bit older than 10 years old, to be honest with you. I'm getting that slightly sawdusty American oak note, a little bit of honey, dustiness again. It's getting really quite dusty. I mean, this is lovely. I mean, I can't remember what it retails for now. I would guess we're looking at sort of 40s, but yeah, that's pretty damn good, it has to be said. And I've been a big fan of Black Bottle for donkey's ears, even, like I said, when it was in its previous incarnation, and that is just getting a lovely whiff there of tangerine. That's complex. That's a good whiskey. Let's see what the power's like. Soft, dense, again, quite honeyed, more barley centric, I would say, on the palate. A little bit of salt, a little bit of smoke, touch of coffee, a little bit of a wisp of smoke, touch of spice. Again, lovely sawdusty oak on the finish, and it feels older than 10, not by a huge amount, but that sawdusty note really does kind of come through and sort of give it that kind of feeling of age. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there is some slightly older malts going into this, and because at the end of the day, this is it. You know, it's kind of, yes, like I keep saying, blended malts are, or blended whiskies, I should say, are primarily all about the price point. But sometimes it's kind of like, you know, when you're going for a little bit more premium end, or sort of mid-ground, you wanted to sort of stand out, and yes, use a little bit of older malt if you can get away with it, and certainly I think that's what they've done here, and that has just resulted in a lovely, lovely whiskey.
Leave this life behind. Lay your head down, the tide stays
Let's move on to the William Lawson 13-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Quite soft, oaky again, vanilla, caramel, toffee. It's quite a bit of grain coming through. It's got a sort of green fruits, a little bit of honey, lime, citrus. There's an edge to it, it has to be said. There's sort of, yeah, okay. Again, we're not hugely complex, and it actually doesn't smell as old as the black bottle, which does kind of like, is a bit surprising. I mean, it's been, in this instance, 10 years since I actually tasted this particular sample, and it's actually quite intriguing to sort of come back to it after all this time. Again, it's a pleasant blend. I mean, it's not going to sort of like, you know, set your pants on fire. But, you know, and again, it's another one of those kind of, well, what does it retail for? And to be honest with you, I haven't got a clue. Let's put the pass right. Again, quite oaky, toffee, caramel. I don't want to go out on a limb and say that maybe that caramel isn't natural, but because it could be, because there is a lot of oak, so, you know, it could well be. Possibly too much oak. I'm not getting a great deal of complexity. It's okay, it's pleasant, it's not sort of nasty. There's the grain kind of peeks through right on the finish. It's got a nice kind of citrus note on the aftertaste, along with that little nip of the grain. Unpretentious, I suppose, if you're being sort of, you know, that way inclined. It's okay. You can see that you'd be quite happy to sort of drink this and not really notice it at the end of the day. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Who knows? It's not the most, like I say, it's not the most complex, but I love the bottle. Right, Grouse time. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Well, you can smell that that's got some age. Quite herbal, rich, a little bit confected, some potpourri, sherry, barley, apple, citrus, a little bit of white flowers. I mean, it's got some good complexity. If you didn't know this was Grouse, you would probably say that's actually not too shabby. It's got some nice maltiness. There's a little bit of licorice. It does kind of feel like there's a fair bit of Bunnahabhain in the mix here. It's got that kind of fleshy, apricot-y kind of Bunnahabhain-y kind of character, although not a huge amount of salt. There's a little bit of salt, So maybe there's a bit of Macallan in here as well. I mean, you would have thought so, given what the distilleries they own. And you know what? I'm not getting an awful lot of Glenrothes. I'm not getting an awful lot of industrial, and that's the key thing that with sort of like the no age statement Grouse. It is pretty industrial, it has to be said. This is, I hate to say it, but this is not a bad nose at all. Let's see what the pass like. That opens up with a bit of vanilla, a bit of American oak, some malt, barley, citrus, moves into sort of like dried plums, get the little bit of sherry dried fruit coming through on the mid palate. Again, judicious sherry, not a big sherry monster. A little bit of treacle, spice, licorice on the aftertaste. Okay, it's not blowing me away with its complexity, but you know, I just remember sort of like when I got told what it was, I was going, really? Wow. So for a Grouse, it's actually pretty pleasant. It's quite drinkable. I mean, God knows how much that would have cost back in 2014. But yeah, so it goes to show at the end of the day, like I keep saying, it's all about the sort of like, you know, your price point. You know, blended whiskey can be really quite fun, can be good. It can be god awful, it has to be said. But in this instance, this Grouse, I ain't going to shoot it. On to the final whisky of the afternoon. So this is a Label 5 blended Scotch whisky, extra rare 18-year-old. Wow, mouthful. Let's see if this is as well. Okay, so you can smell some age on it. It's got that developing sort of oxidised sub-cognac-y kind of rancio. It's quite velvety. It's got some American oak, barley, dusty oak. Definitely smells like an 18-year-old whisky, it has to be said. A little bit of lime, some gooseberry. Very complex. It's a lovely whisky, it has to be said. There's a little bit of toasty oak, some butter, a little bit of herbal grain. Harmonious, lovely, it has to be said. And this is, like I said, this is where it all comes down to. If you're playing around with some good quality raw materials, some raw materials that have got some lovely age to it as well, and I suspect again there may well be some older malts than 18 in this, but because it does smell an awful lot older than 18, you're going to get more bang for your buck. I must admit, I don't know the range particularly well. I think this is pretty much the only Label 5. I think I might have tasted the no age statement, but like a lot of these whiskies, that doesn't kind of stick in the memory. But this is good. This is lovely, it has to be said. That's what it tastes like. Soft. It's got that kind of milky, lactosey kind of vanilla character going on, a little bit of cream caramel. I'm not getting a lot of dusty age. I'm getting a lot of oxidation age. It tastes like, I say, sub sort of cognac-y kind of oxidation character. A little bit of crisp grain coming through on the finish with a little bit of citrus as well. It lingers really nicely. It's a lovely blend at the end of the day. Like I said, it kicks off with that lovely maturity and finishes with a little bit of more of a crisp note coming through from the grain. It's got good progression. Yeah, I think that's pretty good.
Tell me why it's always this way.
Right, okay, so that's some of today's episode of the show. Well, I thought it was good fun. At the end of the day, there was certainly no real stinkers. The two Scotch leader bottlings, yeah, I mean, the signature was slightly more complex, although nose-wise, the palate was maybe didn't quite live up to the complexity that the nose was showing at the end of the day. But the original was quite pleasant. I mean, if that was a sort of like 20 quid, 30 quid maybe bottle of whiskey, you wouldn't be disappointed by that. You know, it's not, like I say, it's not going to blow you away, but you're not going to sort of like want to chuck it down the sink. I think I was less enamoured by the signature bottling, because I just didn't think that the palate kind of lived up to the nose. But again, it wasn't a particularly bad whiskey. I think the sort of the black bottle 10-year-old was just fantastic. I mean, it's just a lovely whiskey at the end of the day. Certainly tastes a little bit older than 10 years old, and there may well be a little bit of older whiskey in there, which then kind of goes to show that the blenders are kind of looking at putting together, you know, a quality blended whiskey, as opposed to sort of worrying about what price it's going to hit the shelves at. The Lawson's, well, yeah, it was all right. Okay, I mean, again, you know, it wasn't sort of a poor whiskey. It probably didn't have the complexity of say the black bottle. But you know, again, you wouldn't be too upset about that. The 16-year-old famous Grouse, well, you know, it's like I said, it just keeps coming down to the sort of like what your raw materials are all about at the end of the day. And you know, we know famous Grouse is cheap, cheerful, and pretty grim at the end of the day. But you know, put some good quality. So I mean, and can you imagine being the blender for sort of some of these cheap whiskies at the end of the day? You must be sort of like, you know, I don't know. Maybe they just kind of like go, well, it's my job. I have to put together sort of like, you know, this cheap crap. When in reality, I want to do something more amazing with my talents. Because at the end of the day, you know, blenders are really talented individuals. You know, you've got to be to get to that kind of point. And there you are. You're sort of like blending famous Grouse. It's kind of like, oh, that must be a real disappointment. I imagine. But anyway, so it goes to show that if you're going to play around with sort of good aged components, you're going to get something quite nice. And the same, I suppose, to a certain extent goes for the Label 5. Again, good quality raw materials, lovely age, again feels older than 18, more than happy with that. So yeah, I think this has been a fun episode of the show. All that's left to say is I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode of the show. My battery's about to run out, which is why I'm going rather quickly. So until next time, and I don't know when that's going to be because we're in the silly period now, as you well know. So until then, good afternoon and good dramming.